The dust kicked up in thick clouds as the convoy rolled through the narrow mountain pass in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos gripped her M24 sniper rifle tighter, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain ahead. She had been assigned to support SEAL Team Alpha on what intelligence called a routine extraction mission. Nothing about this place felt routine to her. The radio crackled with chatter from the team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison. His voice carried the calm authority that had kept his men alive through dozens of operations. Behind him, 6 elite SEALs moved with practiced precision, their weapons ready, eyes constantly moving. They were heading to extract a high-value informant who had been feeding crucial intelligence about Taliban positions in the region. Maria had earned her place on this mission through exceptional marksmanship scores and nerves of steel. At 28, she had already completed 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. The SEALs had specifically requested her after hearing about her record-breaking shot that had saved an entire platoon near Kandahar 6 months earlier. But she knew that respect had to be earned fresh with every mission. The informant, codenamed Falcon, was holed up in a small village at the end of this treacherous mountain path. Intelligence suggested the Taliban knew about his activities and were closing in. The window for extraction was narrow, maybe 6 hours before enemy forces would overrun the area. The mission seemed straightforward enough, but Maria's instincts told her something was wrong. As they approached the village, the silence was deafening. No children playing, no elderly men sitting in doorways, no women hanging laundry. The place felt abandoned, like a ghost town. Lieutenant Commander Morrison raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Through her scope, Maria could see the designated safe house where Falcon was supposed to be waiting. The building looked intact, but there were no signs of life. Morrison's voice came through her earpiece in a whisper. "Santos, you see anything?" Maria adjusted her scope, scanning windows, rooftops, and shadows. Years of training had taught her to trust her gut, and right now, every fiber of her being was screaming danger. The village was too quiet, too perfect. It felt like a trap waiting to spring. The team had been walking for 3 hours since leaving their vehicles at the base of the mountain. The plan was simple: get in, grab Falcon, and get out before the Taliban realized what had happened. But as Maria studied the layout through her scope, she began to notice details that made her blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt that hadn't been in the intelligence photos. Windows that should have had curtains were now bare. And most troubling of all, she could see the glint of metal from at least 3 different positions on the surrounding hills. She keyed her radio. "Commander, we've got problems. This place is compromised." Morrison trusted his sniper's judgment completely. In previous operations, her sharp eyes had saved them from ambushes and identified threats that others had missed. If Santos said there was trouble, there was trouble. The SEAL team took defensive positions behind a low stone wall that ran along the village's edge. Morrison studied the terrain through his binoculars, confirming what Maria had spotted. They were walking into a carefully prepared ambush. The question now was whether Falcon was already dead, captured, or if this was an elaborate trap using him as bait. As if answering their unspoken question, a figure appeared in the doorway of the safe house. Through her scope, Maria could see it was indeed Falcon, but something was wrong with the way he moved. His hands seemed to be positioned unnaturally, and he kept looking over his shoulder. Either he was terrified, or he was being controlled by someone just out of sight. Morrison had to make a decision that would determine whether his team lived or died. Intel suggested Falcon had information about a major Taliban offensive planned for the following week. Thousands of coalition lives could depend on extracting him successfully, but every tactical instinct told him they were outnumbered and outgunned in terrain that heavily favored the enemy. The SEALs had built their reputation on completing impossible missions, on never leaving anyone behind, on pushing forward when others would retreat. But they had also survived by being smart, by knowing when to fight and when to find another way. As Morrison weighed their options, Maria kept her scope trained on the surrounding hills, counting muzzle flashes and estimating enemy positions. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of voices speaking in Pashto. Maria's language, Training allowed her to catch fragments of the conversation. They were discussing timing, waiting for the Americans to move closer to the village center. The trap was set, and the enemy was simply waiting for them to walk into it. The mission, that had started as a routine extraction, was rapidly becoming a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Morrison's decision came swift and decisive. "We go in, but we go smart," he whispered into his radio. The SEAL team would split into 2 groups. 4 operators would create a diversion on the eastern approach, while Morrison, 1 other SEAL, and Maria would attempt to reach Falcon from the west. It was risky, but it was their best chance of completing the mission and getting everyone home alive. Maria shifted her position to a rocky outcrop that gave her a commanding view of both the village and the surrounding hills. From here, she could provide overwatch for both teams and hopefully thin out the enemy numbers before they realized what was happening. Her M24 was loaded with match-grade ammunition, each round capable of taking down a target at over 800 meters. As the diversion team moved into position, Maria began her deadly work. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters positioned behind rocks, in old buildings, and along ridge lines. They were well concealed, but years of training had taught her to spot the subtle signs that gave away hidden positions. The slight movement of fabric in still air, the unnatural shadow that didn't match the surrounding terrain, the brief glint of sunlight off metal. Her first shot took down a Taliban spotter on the eastern ridge. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder, and suddenly the entire mountainside erupted in gunfire. The diversion team had begun their assault, drawing enemy fire away from Morrison's approach to the safe house. Maria worked her bolt action smoothly, acquiring targets and eliminating them with mechanical precision. But for every Taliban fighter she dropped, 2 more seemed to appear. The enemy had prepared this ambush well, with fighting positions and supply lines that allowed them to maintain sustained fire. Maria counted at least 30 muzzle flashes in the first minute of fighting. The SEALs were facing odds of 5-1, possibly worse. Morrison's team reached the safe house under heavy fire. The building's walls were thick stone, providing some protection, but Taliban rounds were chipping away at the corners and sending deadly fragments flying. Through her scope, Maria watched Morrison kick down the door and disappear inside with his teammate. Seconds felt like hours as she waited for some sign that they had found Falcon. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Falcon is alive, but he's wounded. Looks like they worked him over pretty good before we got here." The informant had been beaten and was barely conscious, but he was breathing. More importantly, he still had the intelligence they needed. But getting him out of the village alive was going to require a miracle. Maria's position was beginning to draw heavy return fire. Taliban fighters had figured out where the devastating long-range shots were coming from, and they were concentrating their efforts on her rocky perch. Bullets whined off the stones around her, sending sharp fragments in all directions. One piece of shrapnel opened a cut along her cheek, but she ignored the blood and kept shooting. The diversion team was running low on ammunition. Their radio calls were becoming more urgent as they reported increasing enemy pressure. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, leading the eastern team, estimated they were facing at least 40 Taliban fighters, with more arriving from surrounding positions. The enemy had turned their ambush into a full-scale assault. Morrison's voice came through the radio with grim news. "Santos, we're pinned down in here. Buildings surrounded, and Falcon can't walk on his own. We need a way out, or this is going to get very messy very fast." Maria could hear the automatic weapons fire intensifying around the safe house. The Taliban were closing in, and time was running out. She adjusted her scope and began targeting the fighters closest to Morrison's position. Each shot had to count now. Her ammunition supply was finite, and every round needed to eliminate a threat or create an opportunity for her teammates to move. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. Reduce enemy numbers faster than they could close the distance. But even as Maria worked with deadly efficiency, she could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. The Taliban had the high ground, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. They were systematically tightening the noose around both SEAL teams. The diversion team was being pushed back toward the village center, while Morrison's team was trapped in a building that was quickly becoming their tomb. Through her scope, Maria watched enemy fighters positioning a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The weapon was aimed directly at the safe house where Morrison, his teammate, and Falcon were trapped. One RPG round through those stone walls would end the mission permanently. She had maybe 10 seconds to take the shot before the grenade launcher could fire. The distance was extreme, nearly 600 meters with a crosswind that would affect bullet trajectory. The target was partially concealed behind rocks, presenting only a small portion of his body as a viable target. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging shot. Under combat conditions, with incoming fire and the lives of her teammates hanging in the balance, it was nearly impossible. Maria controlled her breathing, let her heart rate settle, and squeezed the trigger. The M24 bucked against her shoulder, and through her scope, she watched the Taliban fighter with the RPG crumple behind his cover. But her relief was short-lived. Another fighter immediately moved to take his place, and this one was already shouldering the weapon. The second Taliban fighter with the RPG was smarter than the first. He kept most of his body behind cover, presenting only the smallest possible target. Maria had to make an impossible shot through a gap no bigger than a man's head, at a distance, where the slightest miscalculation would mean death for her teammates. She steadied her rifle, compensated for wind and distance, and fired. The bullet found its mark just as the Taliban fighter was about to pull the trigger. The RPG round fired wild, exploding harmlessly against a hillside 50 meters away. But Maria knew she had only bought her team seconds. More enemy fighters were moving into position, and her elevated perch was becoming untenable under concentrated fire. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece with desperate urgency. "Santos, we need immediate extraction. Falcon's bleeding out, and we're taking heavy fire from 3 sides. How copy?" Maria could hear the strain in his voice. These were some of the most elite warriors in the world, and they were trapped like animals in a cage. The diversion team was in equally desperate straits. Rodriguez reported that they were down to their last magazines and falling back to a defensive position near the village edge. 3 of his 4 men had taken wounds, though none were life-threatening yet. They could hold their position for maybe 10 more minutes before being overrun. Maria made a tactical assessment that chilled her to the bone. The Taliban had committed at least 60 fighters to this ambush, with more streaming in from surrounding positions. The SEALs were outnumbered more than 8 to 1, low on ammunition, and trapped in terrain that offered few escape routes. By every military doctrine she had learned, this was the moment to call for immediate evacuation and accept mission failure. But looking through her scope at the safe house where Morrison was trapped with a wounded informant, Maria realized that evacuation wasn't an option. The nearest helicopter landing zone was 3 kilometers away across open ground. Taliban fighters controlled all the high ground between their current position and safety. Any attempt to withdraw would result in the team being picked off one by one as they crossed the valley floor. She keyed her radio to Morrison. "Commander, what's your assessment of tactical withdrawal?" There was a long pause before his response came back, and when it did, his voice carried the weight of inevitable truth. "Negative on withdrawal. We'd never make it across open ground. With wounded. We hold here or we don't go home at all." The reality of their situation settled over Maria like a cold blanket. The SEALs were considering something that went against every instinct, every training protocol, every survival doctrine they had learned. They were considering withdrawal not because it was tactically sound, but because staying meant certain death. And if they withdrew now, Falcon would die, and thousands of coalition troops would walk into the Taliban offensive he had warned them about. Maria adjusted her position and took stock of her remaining ammunition. 18 rounds left in her current magazine with 2 spare magazines in her pack, 60 rounds total to hold off an army. It should have been laughable, but instead, she felt a strange calm descending over her. Sometimes the mathematics of war came down to simple choices: fight or surrender, live or die, complete the mission or abandon it. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters massing for a final assault on both SEAL positions. They had grown, tired of the long-range duel, and were preparing to overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers. Groups of fighters were moving from cover to cover, working their way closer to both the safe house and the diversion team's position. Morrison's voice came through her earpiece one final time before the assault began. "All stations, this is actual. We are heavily outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Mission success is unlikely, and tactical withdrawal may not be possible. Each man makes his own choice now." It was a commander's way of saying that anyone who wanted to run for it had his permission. No one would be court-martialed for self-preservation in an impossible situation. But it was also a challenge to the values that had made them SEALs in the first place. They had sworn never to leave a fallen comrade, never to give up the mission, never to surrender as long as they could still fight. Maria heard Rodriguez respond first from the eastern position. "Negative on withdrawal, actual. We hold the line." One by one, each SEAL confirmed the same decision. They would stay and fight, knowing that survival was unlikely but that mission completion was still possible. As the Taliban assault began in earnest, Maria raised her M24 and settled into a shooting position she knew she might never leave. The enemy fighters were advancing in waves, using covering fire and tactical movement to close the distance. Her job now was to buy time, to thin their numbers, and to make them pay dearly for every meter of ground. Her first shot dropped the lead fighter in the assault on Morrison's position. The second took down a Taliban commander who was directing fire teams. The third eliminated a machine gunner who had been suppressing the diversion team. Each shot was perfect, each target carefully selected for maximum tactical impact. But for every enemy fighter she eliminated, the Taliban seemed to have two more ready to take his place. They were advancing with the confidence of overwhelming numbers, knowing that time and ammunition were on their side. Maria worked her bolt action with mechanical precision, but she could feel the tactical situation slipping away like sand through her fingers. The Taliban fighters reached the stone wall that marked the village's outer edge. From there, it was only 100 meters of open ground to the safe house where Morrison was trapped. Maria shifted her fire to the closest threats, but she knew she couldn't stop them all. The final assault was beginning, and everything now depended on 18 rounds and whatever ammunition the pinned-down SEALs had left. Maria watched through her scope as Taliban fighters vaulted over the stone wall and began their sprint across the open ground toward Morrison's position. She had seconds to make shots that would determine whether her teammates lived or died. The first runner fell at 80 meters, the second at 75. But more kept coming and she couldn't stop them all. Her ammunition count was dropping fast. 15 rounds, 14, 13. Each shot had to be perfect, but perfect wasn't enough when facing overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Even if every remaining bullet found its target, she couldn't eliminate enough enemy fighters to prevent them from reaching the safe house. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos on the radio. "Santos, they're at the door. We're down to pistol rounds and whatever grenades we have left." She could hear automatic weapons fire echoing from inside the stone building, punctuated by the sharp crack of pistol shots. The SEALs were making their final stand room by room against impossible odds. The diversion team was faring no better. Rodriguez reported Taliban fighters were within 50 meters of their position and closing fast. His team had expended their last rifle ammunition and were preparing to fight with pistols and bayonets. These elite warriors, trained to operate behind enemy lines and complete impossible missions, were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Maria made a decision that went against every tactical doctrine she had learned. Instead of continuing to target individual fighters, she shifted her aim to a stack of wooden crates near the village center. Intelligence had identified the location as a possible ammunition depot. If she was right, and if her shot found the right target, she might be able to create enough chaos to give her teammates a fighting chance. Her shot struck the crate's dead center. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the entire village center erupted in a massive explosion that sent Taliban fighters diving for cover and threw debris hundreds of feet into the air. The blast wave shattered windows throughout the village and created a mushroom cloud of dust and smoke that temporarily blinded everyone on the battlefield. In the confusion that followed, Morrison's voice came through the radio with grim satisfaction. "Nice shooting, Santos. You just bought us maybe 5 minutes. Taliban are regrouping, but they're a lot more cautious now." The explosion had killed at least a dozen enemy fighters and wounded many more. More importantly, it had disrupted their coordinated assault and forced them to reconsider their tactics. Maria used the respite to change positions. Her previous location had been compromised, and staying there meant certain death. She moved to a new vantage point 50 meters away, one that offered better cover but a more limited field of fire. From here she could still support Morrison's position, but the diversion team would be on their own. As the dust settled, she could see the true extent of Taliban losses. The ammunition depot explosion had been devastating, creating a crater where the village center had been and spreading destruction throughout the surrounding buildings. But even with these losses, the enemy still held overwhelming numerical superiority. Taliban commanders were already reorganizing their forces, pulling back to safer distances and preparing for a more methodical assault. They had learned to respect the Americans' fighting ability, but they also knew that time was on their side. Eventually, the SEALs would run out of ammunition, and when that happened, the outcome was inevitable. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with news that chilled Maria's blood. "Actual, we've got wounded. Thompson took a round in the chest and Martinez can't use his right arm. We're down to our last pistol magazines." The diversion team was disintegrating under relentless pressure, and there was nothing Maria could do to help them from her current position. She made another impossible decision. Abandoning her elevated position, Maria began moving toward the village center. It meant giving up her primary advantage as a sniper, but it also meant she could provide direct support to both teams. The M24 was designed for long-range precision shooting, not close-quarters combat, but it was still a deadly weapon in skilled hands. Moving through the ruins created by the ammunition depot explosion, Maria found herself in a nightmare landscape of broken stone, twisted metal, and scattered debris. Taliban fighters were using the same cover to reposition for their next assault. She found herself in close-quarters combat with enemies who appeared from behind rubble piles and collapsed walls. Her first encounter was with a Taliban fighter who emerged from a destroyed building not 10 feet away. The man was raising his AK-47 when Maria's rifle cracked, the heavy bullet spinning him around and dropping him instantly. But the shot had revealed her position to other nearby fighters, and suddenly she was taking fire from multiple directions. Maria rolled behind, a concrete barrier that had once been part of a market stall. Bullets whined overhead and chipped chunks from her cover. She was trapped in the same kind of deadly situation as her teammates, pinned down by superior numbers with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. But her new position also offered unexpected opportunities. Through gaps in the rubble, she could see Taliban fighters preparing for their final assault on Morrison's safe house. They were setting up a machine gun that would make any movement from the building impossible. If that weapon became operational, Morrison's team would be trapped until their ammunition ran out. Maria had one shot at the machine gun crew before they could complete their setup. The range was close, maybe 60 meters, but she would have to expose herself to take the shot. Taliban fighters were already moving to flank her position, and in seconds she would be completely surrounded. She took a deep breath, rolled out from behind her cover, and acquired the target. The machine gunner was just settling behind his weapon when Maria's bullet found him. But even as the enemy fighter fell, return fire from his companions forced her to dive back behind cover. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Maria was surrounded, Morrison's team was trapped, and the diversion team was down to pistols against assault rifles. The ammunition depot explosion had given them precious minutes, but those minutes were running out. Soon, very soon, the Taliban would mount their final assault, and when they did, superior numbers would carry the day. The Taliban fighters were closing in on Maria's position from 3 sides. She could hear them communicating in hushed voices, coordinating their approach to eliminate the sniper who had been wreaking havoc on their assault. Her ammunition was down to 8 rounds, and each shot now carried the weight of life and death for her entire team. From her position behind the concrete barrier, Maria could see Morrison's safe house through a gap in the rubble. Taliban fighters were using the cover of destroyed buildings to get within grenade range. If they succeeded in getting close enough to throw explosives through the windows, the mission would end in catastrophic failure. She made a tactical decision. That would have seemed insane under normal circumstances. Instead of conserving ammunition for defensive shooting, Maria began engaging targets at maximum rate of fire. Her goal was no longer precision elimination of specific threats, but rather creating enough chaos and casualties to disrupt the enemy's coordinated assault. Her first shot took down a Taliban fighter who was carrying what appeared to be satchel charges toward Morrison's position. The explosives scattered across the ground as the man fell, temporarily halting the advance of fighters behind him. Her second shot eliminated a commander who was directing the assault, causing confusion in the ranks as subordinates argued over who should take charge. But rapid fire meant faster ammunition depletion, and Maria knew she was burning through her remaining rounds at an unsustainable rate. She had maybe 2 minutes of effective shooting left before she would be reduced to her sidearm, a pistol that would be virtually useless against enemy fighters at these distances. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece with desperate urgency. "All stations, we are being overrun on the eastern approach. Request immediate support." The diversion team was down to their last stand, with wounded men fighting with pistols against assault rifles. Maria could see muzzle flashes from their position, but the volume of fire was decreasing as their ammunition ran out. Morrison's situation was equally critical. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters had reached the safe house walls and were preparing to breach the building from multiple directions. Falcon was wounded and barely conscious, making rapid movement impossible even if an escape route presented itself. As Maria engaged her sixth target, she felt the familiar click of an empty magazine. She performed a tactical reload, slapping her second spare magazine into the weapon and chambering a round. 15 bullets left between her and the end of effective resistance. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple. Taliban fighters were now advancing on her position with confidence. They had identified her location and were moving to eliminate the threat she represented. Maria could hear boots crunching on broken concrete as they approached from multiple angles. Her elevated position was becoming a tomb, just as Morrison's safe house had become his. But something unexpected happened as the Taliban fighters closed in. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors began to echo through the valley, growing steadily louder. Maria's heart leaped with hope until she realized the aircraft could be friend or foe. Taliban forces had been known to use captured helicopters, and even friendly forces might not be able to identify targets in the chaos of close combat. Through her earpiece, she heard Morrison's voice with barely controlled excitement. "All stations, we have possible air support inbound. Marking our positions with smoke now." Red smoke began billowing from the safe house windows, the international signal for friendly forces requiring immediate assistance. The helicopter that appeared over the ridge was an American Apache attack helicopter, its weapon systems already oriented toward Taliban positions. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio on the emergency frequency. "Ground stations, this is Thunder 6-1. We have eyes on red smoke and are engaging hostile targets. Keep your heads down." The Apache's 30mm cannon opened fire with devastating effect. Taliban fighters who had been advancing with confidence suddenly found themselves under attack from above by one of the most sophisticated weapons platforms in the world. The cannon's depleted uranium rounds tore through cover that had seemed impregnable, eliminating enemy positions in seconds. But the helicopter's arrival also triggered a desperate response from Taliban commanders. They knew that air support meant the tactical situation had shifted dramatically against them. Their only chance now was to complete their assault before the Apache could systematically destroy their forces. Maria watched through her scope as Taliban fighters abandoned caution and launched an all-out assault on Morrison's position. They were willing to accept massive casualties if it meant completing their mission before being destroyed from above. The safe house was suddenly under attack from every direction simultaneously. The Apache pilot was doing his best to provide close support, but the proximity of friendly and enemy forces made precision strikes impossible. Taliban fighters were literally at the walls of Morrison's building, too close for the helicopter to engage without risking American lives. Maria made her final tactical decision. With 8 rounds left in her rifle, she abandoned her defensive position and began moving toward Morrison's location. The sniper rifle was designed for long-range precision, not close-quarters battle, but she was the only person in position to provide immediate support to her trapped teammates. Moving through the rubble-strewn landscape, Maria encountered Taliban fighters who were equally desperate to reach their objective. Her first engagement was at point-blank range with an enemy fighter who rounded a corner just as she did. The M24's heavy bullet at close range was devastating, but the shot also revealed her position to other nearby enemies. She was now in the same desperate situation as her teammates, fighting at close range with limited ammunition against superior numbers. But her movement toward Morrison's position was drawing Taliban fighters away from their assault on the safe house, buying precious time for the Apache to reposition for effective strikes. The helicopter's cannon fire was getting closer to Taliban positions as the pilot identified targets that could be engaged safely. Each burst eliminated multiple enemy fighters and disrupted their coordinated assault. But Maria knew that time was still running out. She had 6 rounds left, and Taliban fighters were converging on her position from every direction. Maria reached the final stretch of rubble-filled ground between her position and Morrison's safe house. Taliban fighters were everywhere, some trying to breach the building, others turning to engage the sniper who had been devastating their ranks. She had 4 rounds left and at least a dozen targets within killing distance. Her first shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was about to throw a grenade through the safe house window. The explosive device rolled harmlessly away as the man fell, but 2 more fighters immediately moved to take his place. Maria worked her bolt action and fired again, dropping the second grenade thrower before he could complete his attack. The Apache helicopter had finally found angles where it could provide effective support. Its cannon fire walked across Taliban positions with mechanical precision, each burst eliminating multiple targets. But the enemy fighters closest to the safe house were in a dead zone, where the pilot couldn't engage without hitting the building where Morrison was trapped. With 2 rounds remaining, Maria made a decision that would haunt military historians for years. Instead of conserving her ammunition for defensive shooting, she targeted the 2 Taliban fighters who posed the greatest immediate threat to Morrison's team. Her shots were perfect, eliminating both targets, but left her with an empty rifle and surrounded by enemies. The Taliban fighters realized that the deadly sniper was finally out of ammunition. They began advancing on her position with renewed confidence, knowing that she was reduced to a sidearm against their assault rifles. Maria drew her pistol and prepared for what she knew would be her final engagement. But something remarkable happened in that moment of apparent defeat. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece with strength she hadn't heard in hours. "Santos, you magnificent warrior, you just gave us the opening we needed." The elimination of the closest threats had created a gap in Taliban lines that Morrison could exploit. The safe house door burst open and Morrison emerged carrying the wounded Falcon while his teammate provided covering fire. They were making a desperate dash for the extraction point, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. The Taliban fighters turned their attention from Maria to prevent the Americans from escaping with their prize. Maria's pistol cracked repeatedly as she engaged targets at the edge of her weapon's effective range. Each shot was aimed to disrupt rather than eliminate, forcing Taliban fighters to take cover instead of pursuing Morrison's team. She was buying seconds with bullets, trading her own survival for her teammates' chance at escape. The Apache pilot saw the movement and immediately shifted his fire to create a corridor of destruction between Morrison's team and their pursuers. The helicopter's cannon eliminated Taliban positions with surgical precision, cutting down fighters who tried to intercept the fleeing Americans. Rodriguez's diversion team, despite their wounds and depleted ammunition, launched a final assault to draw attention away from Morrison's escape route. These wounded warriors charged Taliban positions with nothing but pistols and determination, creating chaos in the enemy ranks at the moment it was most needed. Maria's pistol ran dry just as Taliban fighters closed within 20 meters of her position. She had no more ammunition, no more options, and no more time. But as she prepared for the inevitable, the Apache's cannon fire reached her area, eliminating the closest threats in a burst of devastating firepower. Morrison's team reached the extraction point where a second helicopter, a Black Hawk medical evacuation bird, was waiting with rotors turning. Falcon was loaded aboard and immediately began receiving medical attention from the flight medic. The wounded informant was unconscious but alive, and more importantly, the intelligence he carried would save thousands of coalition lives. The Apache pilot's voice came through the radio with urgent instructions. All ground personnel, mark your positions for immediate extraction. We have more hostiles inbound from the east. Taliban reinforcements were arriving, turning the tactical situation critical once again. Rodriguez's team was extracted first, with wounded men being carried to the waiting helicopter under covering fire from the Apache. Despite their injuries and exhaustion, they had completed their mission and lived to fight another day. The diversion that was supposed to be a supporting role had become a crucial element of mission success. Maria was the last to reach the extraction point, moving through terrain that the Apache had cleared with devastating effectiveness. Taliban resistance had collapsed under the combined pressure of precision airstrikes and determined ground fighting. The enemy forces that had seemed so overwhelming were now scattered and demoralized. As the Black Hawk lifted off with all personnel aboard, Maria looked down at the village that had nearly become their tomb. The cost had been high, with multiple wounded and ammunition expenditures that would require detailed explanation to higher command. But the mission was complete, and every American was going home alive. Falcon survived his injuries and provided intelligence that prevented a major Taliban offensive targeting coalition supply lines. His information led to the capture or elimination of dozens of enemy commanders and the disruption of weapons smuggling networks throughout the region. The cost of the extraction mission was measured in bullets and blood, but the strategic value was immeasurable. Maria Santos received the Silver Star for her actions during the extraction mission, though she would later say that the real heroes were the SEALs who chose to stay and fight when withdrawal seemed like the only rational option. Her marksmanship had been exceptional, but her courage in the face of impossible odds had been extraordinary. Morrison and his SEAL team were quietly recognized for their role in one of the most successful high-value extractions of the war. They had faced overwhelming odds, considered withdrawal when tactical doctrine demanded it, but ultimately chose to hold their ground and complete the mission. It was this decision that defined not just the operation, but the character of the warriors who served. Years later, military analysts would study the engagement as a textbook example of how small unit tactics, individual courage, and air support integration could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But for those who lived through it, the lesson was simpler. When everything is on the line, some people choose to raise their weapons and hold their ground, no matter what the cost.